Now, we're going to take a detour. So just let's clear our head for a second. The detour is through precipitation rate land. So precipitation rates they're a critical part of irrigation scheduling. And often we just, look at a chart to figure out what the precipitation rate is, or we guess what the precipitation rate is. I mean, I know I have. Looking at a chart is probably the way that most people determine this. But remember, this whole course is about, being dropped into a landscape from a helicopter and being able to figure it out without all these massive charts. And you're going to say, yes, you used a chart for available water holding capacity. But I'm going to tell you, after you do that a couple of times, you remember how much water soil, clay has or sand has, and you mostly work in one or the other. So it doesn't, that's not a chart you carry around in your back pocket. But your precipitation rate chart might be one that you would really have to rely on. And precipitation rate it's one of, calculating it is kind of one of these overlooked skills. This particular type of calculation is going to be very, very valuable to you if you have to talk to anybody about capturing rainwater in soil. So we're going to come back to precipitation rate, in like 3 modules, but for irrigation purposes, we need to be able to just calculate it out. And it looks really hard because the formulas are these gnarly little formulas, but it's not that difficult. So bear with me, and I'm going to help you kind of break it down. So precipitation rate is basically going to help us determine how quickly is water being applied to the soil. And sometimes it's called application rate, actually, when you talk about irrigation, to distinguish it from rainwater. But the application or precipitation rate is always, always, always expressed in inches of water per hour, inches per hour. And there are basically 2 scenarios for calculating precipitation rate. One scenario is when you have individual emitters emitting water. And those individual emitters could be spray irrigation, like spray emitters emitting it, or it could be drip emitters that are like in a random pattern in your landscape, and they're emitting water. There's no particular pattern to it. That's one scenario, and it's the same way to calculate whether it's spray or drip. It's the same way. There are some tricky things to convert from gallons per minute to gallons per hour, but we'll get to that in a second. So that's one instance. The other circumstance is if you have a drip irrigation system and it's configured in a grid pattern and it uses inline emitters. So this is emitters that are in the irrigation tubing at regular intervals. And then those tubes that tubing rather, is placed in the soil at regular intervals in between the tubes. So you have a grid pattern of emitters on a regular interval and then spacing of the rows on a regular interval. If you have that scenario, it is a different method for calculating precipitation rate. So 2 ways of calculating precipitation rate. For the first one, for the spray emitters or the randomly placed, whether it's inline or online, random pattern drip irrigation, you need to know the number of emitters that you have out there, the total gallons per minute for the irrigation zone, and the square footage of the zone. If you are doing a grid pattern, you just need to know the flow rate of the emitters, the spacing of the emitters, and the row spacing between the lines. Okay. First, let's talk a little bit about how we figure out total gallons per minute, because we're actually going to have this in the irrigation auditing section. I mean, just in general, this is a pretty good thing. So the thing about the total gallons per minute. I mean, the easiest way to determine total gallons per minute, although it is, no matter what, it's a challenge when you have drip, but technically the easiest way, and it's really easy if you have spray, is to go to the water meter and run the water meter, watch the water meter for 5 minutes and figure out how much water has actually passed through the meter, and then divide by the number of minutes that you were watching, and voila, you have the total gallons per minute for that particular irrigation zone. I forgot to say, turn on the irrigation zone, run it for 5 minutes. You could, that's really the best thing. So in this case, what you do is you record the start number from the water meter, the end number, divide by the number of minutes. I want you to remember that water going through a water meter is going through in gallons per cubic foot. It can't be easy, right? So it's cubic feet, or sometimes, 100 cubic feet. So what you're looking at is you have to convert the, did I say gallons per cubic foot? I'm sorry. What I meant was it's going through the meter in cubic feet of water. So you are going to have to convert that to gallons, of course, right? Can't be easy. And the way that you do that is you basically divide cubic feet by 7.48. And there's 7.48 gallons per cubic foot of water. So you divide the cubic feet number by 7.48 and you come up with the gallons, and that will be able to tell you how many gallons have been delivered per minute. That is the only challenge is remembering to divide by 7.48. Okay, and now if you wanted to calculate your gallons per minute for a random drip pattern, you have a couple of different ways. So I want you just to think about a second what the irrigation, what are the emitters in drip irrigation. So you either have an emitter that's embedded into a drip line at a regular interval, in which case, if you wanted to know how many emitters were out there, you would figure out the number of feet of irrigation line that you have out there, and then divide by the emitter spacing, and that would tell you how many emitters. So if you had 100 feet of irrigation line and you knew that your emitters were every 12 inches, that would be 100 emitters. If you had 100 feet and your spacing was at 2 feet per emitter, you would have 50 emitters, okay? So that's what you're doing for the inline. For online or point source, you usually know how many emitters you have per plant size or type. And so you go around and you count up the plants, multiply it by the number of emitters per plant, and that's going to tell you how many emitters that you have. So either way, you're going to have to do a little bit of investigation and assumption, but investigation, and it is way easier to record this in the beginning when the site is being installed than it is to go back and investigate and figure it out later. Just saying, this is information that installers should have on and designers should have on their plans. All right. So if you want to figure out how many gallons per minute, once you figure out how many emitters you have, you then look up the emitter application rate. So every drip tubing or drip emitter is going to have an application rate that is usually expressed in gallons per hour. So for example, you would have 0.5 gallons per hour emitters. And so that tells you how many gallons per hour each of those emitters is emitting. To figure out the total gallons per hour for the zone, you take your number of emitters, multiply it by that application rate, and that's going to tell you the total gallons per hour for the zone. So remember, drip irrigation is almost always in gallons per hour. Well, not almost always is in gallons per hour. So now you're almost there. You have gallons per hour, but you need gallons per minute. So you're going to divide your gallons per hour by 60 because there's 60 minutes in an hour, and that's going to tell you how many minutes you need. So once you have that gallons per minute, you figured it out either by looking at the meter and figuring it out, or you went and calculated it from the number of emitters and the application rate of the emitters in a drip system. Either way, you now have your zone gallons per minute. So you know how much this irrigation zone is putting out in gallons per minute. And so calculating your precipitation rate isn't that much of a challenge from here. It's really just plugging it into the formula. There is one other thing that you do need to know, and that is the total square footage or area of the zone. Now, tricky thing. Okay, pretty straightforward if you have spray. You just take the, you just measure the square footage of the area that's covered by this spray. Not so hard. If you have random drip and you've got a lot of it, you may want to do this the same thing. Just take the square footage of the zone and that's that. It may drop your precipitation rate a little bit, but it's not significant. Where it gets tricky is when you have a random pattern, but you are basically irrigating like trees that are separated from each other, or shrubs or groups of shrubs that are separated from each other. So it's really like you have a bunch of little islands of plants. And if you took, this is often a strategy for planting a very vast area. So if you took the whole square footage of the area, there would be a lot of it that wasn't getting any irrigation. And so it really doesn't make any sense for that to be part of the precipitation rate calculation. So in the case of, let's say, fruit trees or planter, like shrubby areas that are planted with space between them, a lot of space between them, you want to actually figure out the square footage of the drip line of those trees or of those planter beds. So you would calculate each tree's drip line area, and that sum would be your total zone area for the purposes of your calculation. Yeah, it gets complicated with spray, but it's only complicated in the data gathering part. The calculation part is not, because you're just plugging these numbers into this formula to get it. But you do have to think about this, certain things. And in this case, it's going to be, do you use just the square footage of the whole area? Or is it really going to be one of those cases where you have to go out and figure out what the circumference or what the drip line circumference is to figure out the area of the drip line? So once you get your total gallons per minute for the zone and your square footage for the zone, you plug it into this formula of 96.25 times the total zone GPM, that sum divided by the total zone area. And this is going to give you the precipitation rate in inches per hour. I know, it's crazy. It converts it back to inches per hour. You're converting, and that's what the 96.25 is. It's converting gallons per minute to inches per hour, essentially. Okay, so that's how you figure out your precipitation rate, certainly for spray heads, right? Very straightforward. Gallons per minute for the zone, total zone area, plug it in here. That tells you the inches per hour precipitation rate for the spray head. For the drip, it's also straightforward, but remember, you had to figure out gallons per hour for the zone and convert it into gallons per minute. I know it seems like a lot of hassle, but you do. And then you divide that by the total zone area, square footage, which you may have had to figure out by going out and looking at the circumference of the plants. All right, but you plug that into the same formula, and this will also tell you inches per hour for a drip system randomly laid out. When, and here is some advice for, and actually I recommend that you look at this. This is one of these embedded exercises, exercises with a little help from a friend in the coursework. I recommend that you go through this because it's more of a real life scenario actually, that if for drip anyway, than just random blah blah blah. So here we have a landscape that has a bunch of different plants, and each plant is going to get a different number of emitters around it. So like a 5 gallon is going to get 3 emitters, but a 24-inch box is going, or let's see, what does it say? A 15 gallon is going to get like 5 emitters around it. So what you would be doing to figure out the number of emitters in your landscape is adding up the different plant types and multiplying that by the number of emitters that each of those plants gets. So, if you have 5 1-gallon plants and each one is only getting 1 emitter per plant, then that's 5 emitters. And if you have a 5-gallon plant that gets 3 emitters, it's 3, and so forth. And this will help you to just become facile. By the way, I don't know if you can hear it or not, but there's landscape apocalypse happening next to me. This happens every week, I guess. I don't really think about it except when I'm recording something, but really, why do we have this blower? I live in an urban area, by the way. So whatever. Okay, so hopefully it's not too intrusive. So that's the way that you calculate the total zone gallons per minute for a random drip pattern. A little bit complicated, but you can do it. Just keep your head about you. Now, what about the other drip scenario? That would be a grid pattern. And again, it's a gnarly little formula, but not that difficult once you've gathered the information. So here we need to know the emitter flow rate. Not too much of a problem because it's always published with the particular tubing, and hopefully you have access to the plans or something that tells you what kind of tubing they put down. So emitter flow rate, let's say 1/2 gallon per hour or 1 gallon per hour. And then you want to observe the spacing of the emitters on the line. So that would be every 12 inches, every 18 inches, or maybe every 24 inches. That's where the emitters are embedded in the line. And then finally, you want to observe the distance between the tubing for the grid. So this is called the row spacing, and in inches. And once you get all of that, you plug it into the formula. In this case, we have, in the example, we have a 1 gallon per hour emitter flow rate, spacing every 18 inches and row spacing every 12 inches. And when we plug it in using the conversion of 231.1 times the emitter flow rate divided by the emitter spacing times the row spacing. So make sure in this case that you are not just multiplying and dividing across the row, which we often do. In this case, go ahead and calculate what's inside of the parentheses. So 231.1 times that emitter flow rate, and then divide that by the emitter spacing times row spacing. So here in our scenario, we end up with 1.07 inches per hour. So our 18-inch by 12-inch grid pattern applies water to this entire zone at a rate of 1.07 inches per hour. Okay, now we figured out precipitation rate. We can go back to the total irrigation runtime.